Hi, everyone. It is good to be together again in this way as we continue our study in the book of Hebrews. Today, I'm going to be covering Hebrews chapter 3 through chapter 4, verse 13. There are two main themes that I want to be able to look at today with all of you, and that is that Jesus is greater than Moses. And then the second one being that as disciples, we are called to make every effort. So let's dive right into Hebrews chapter 3, verse 1. And it says, "Therefore, holy brothers and sisters who share in the heavenly calling, fix your thoughts on Jesus, whom we acknowledge as our apostle and high priest." And this really is a good way for me to start off because it talks about fixing our eyes on Jesus. And that word really sticks out to me. And I think, what does that mean to fix our eyes on Jesus? Because it seems like the author is calling us to do something more than just glancing at Jesus or looking at him from a distance, but to fix our eyes on Jesus. And I was looking up that word when I saw it, and it says, it means to ponder carefully, to meditate on, to focus on the true significance of who Jesus is. And that's definitely a deeper take than what I would initially think on my own. But it leads me to ask that question of myself, how am I doing in this area? First of all, what greater time do we have than right now to fix our eyes on Jesus? A lot of us are still at home. A lot of us are still working from home. And, how are we doing with this? I know when I am distracted, it is hard for me to focus my eyes on Jesus and to meditate on who he is and the significance of who he is in my life. But this really calls me as a believer, as a disciple, to slow down enough to make sure that I am understanding who Jesus is. And then it goes on to talk about how Jesus, we acknowledge he is our apostle and high priest. And I love this part just because it shows the authority that Jesus has in our lives. The likely audience, we don't know for sure who it is of this letter to the Hebrews, is likely Jewish Christians. And these two roles are significant. As a high priest, that's like the highest authority that they would know on earth. Is the high priest that is guiding them spiritually, but also as a Christian, an apostle, someone who's sent by God, is also the high authority as a Christian. And so it's acknowledging that Jesus is the highest authority that we have on earth as disciples. And again, you could do a separate study into all of these things because I'm just glancing at them, but these things stick out to me because it does amount to how great Jesus is compared to Moses. And when you look at the scriptures, there are a lot of similarities between Moses and Jesus. You could do another study on that as well. But one of the things that really showed me how different they are, even amongst all the similarities, is it says Moses was a faithful servant in God's house, whereas Jesus is a faithful son over God's house. And just those two sentences alone let me know that Jesus is higher than Moses, because certainly it's higher to be a owner of a house versus a servant in that house. And the exciting part for me in that, the last part of verses 1 through 6, it says, what this house is, God's house. And those who hold firmly to our confidence and the hope in which we glory are God's house. So that encourages me because it lets me know that I'm a part of God's house as a disciple. And Jesus is over that house. So this is the passage that really firms up that Jesus is greater than Moses and really kind of sets the stage for the rest that follows. And as we see in chapter 3, verse 7 through 4, verse 13, the emphasis then becomes on making every effort as people belonging to God's house. There are several references here to the Old Testament, and how the Israelites turned their back on God in unbelief. And actually, this serves as a warning to those who are being written to, but also to us today as disciples. And chapter 3, verse 12, it says, "See to it, brothers and sisters, that none of you has a sinful, unbelieving heart that turns away from the living God." Now I read that, and the thing that sticks out to me is where it says "see to it," because that makes me want to pay attention. If it's telling me to see to it that this happens, I need to pay attention. And so I'm left with the question, though, but how do I see to it that my brothers and sisters don't have a sinful, unbelieving heart? It seems almost impossible for me to take on that task. To make sure that no one else has an unbelieving heart. It's hard enough for me to make sure I don't have an unbelieving heart myself. But, it acknowledges that in this Christian journey, there are many tests and many periods of trials. And we obviously can't do this walk alone. We need each other. And in verse 13 of chapter 3, it actually tells us how can we see to it that we don't have sinful, unbelieving hearts. It says, "But encourage one another daily, as long as it is called today, so that none of you may be hardened by sin's deceitfulness." So here again, we see we are not alone in this walk, even though there are times that it may be challenging. But we are to encourage one another daily so that we're not hardened by sin's deceitfulness. And then on in verse 14, it says, it calls us to hold on to our original convictions firmly until the very end. And so, with these exhortations, we see that we are called to encourage one another. And then we're also called to hold faithfully, firmly until the end to our original conviction. And again, we live in a day and age that's not so different from those who the original author was writing to. It's difficult sometimes to stay faithful until the very end, but that's what's required for our ultimate salvation. And we see the examples of the Israelites who were led out of slavery by Moses in an incredible way that we are still talking about today. But even in that, they lost their faith and stopped believing in God's promises. And the sad thing is, those who stopped believing never got to enter the promised land. They never got to experience God's rest because of their unbelief. And so I asked myself, how am I doing right now in this challenging time? What's my attitude towards God as I have to wait? How am I handling bad news right now? These things remind me of what I see here in the example of the Israelites, that, yeah, it can be hard to hold on to our faith, but that's what we're called to. And the answers that I have to these questions, as all of us, will reveal our level of faith and commitment to God. The Israelites grew impatient and angry with God because they couldn't see his plan and no longer trusted his promises. This is sobering because it lets us know that we can lose our salvation, that we can get to a point where we no longer believe. And then in verse 11, it says, "Let us therefore make every effort to enter that rest, so that no one will perish by following their example of disobedience," referring to the Israelites and their disobedience and referring to God's rest. We serve the same God of the Old Testament, and it is clear from the scriptures that God is a promise keeper. He promises us his rest as well. And God's rest is like no other rest we've ever felt before. And we are called to make every effort to experience this rest. And I know I want to experience that rest, and I want all of you to experience God's rest as well. And what that means is that we make every effort, that we don't ever stop striving to be spiritual or relying on God. It means that we don't get a Christian vacation because there's a virus, or because there's heartache or financial struggles, or even the loss of loved ones. But if we keep making every effort, the day of rest will come and we will get to be a part of it. And then finally, this all wraps up with a description of God's word, as if the author is saying, hey, if you don't believe me, believe God's word at least. And it describes God's word as being alive and active, and how it penetrates us like a sword. It penetrates our hearts to get to the sin and remove it. It exposes our faith for what it is or what it is not. And it shows us that we will be held, what we will be held accountable to. All of these things are very sobering, but at the same time, they're very encouraging as well. We can put our hope on this. We can stand on God's promises and know that everything that we're experiencing right now is temporary, but it's also meant to lead us to God, to point us to Him, so that we one day can all together enter that final rest. Thank you, brothers and sisters, and I hope you continue to enjoy our study of the book of Hebrews.